Human history is filled with incredible moments of triumph, but maybe more so, equally horrific atrocities. Sometimes these incidents occur in desperation, but often, unfortunately, that is simply not the case. Over 1,000 years ago, there was a nation-defining event in East Asia that was a bit of both, and it was horrifying. This is that story, and although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer
they sieged him to death, basically?
discretion is advised.
That sounds terrifying. That's scary.
It goes without saying that China is one of the earliest and oldest continuous civilizations in human history, with written accounts dating back thousands of years. As you might imagine, a written history going that far back is subject to some disagreement. Some historians hold that China's recorded history dates back to around 2100 BCE, while others believe 1600 BCE is a more accurate beginning.
Right.
Whatever the case, it also goes without saying that China has an incredibly rich political and cultural history, and its long history is broken up in two time periods known as dynasties. Depending on who you ask, the first in China's recorded history is the Xia dynasty, although some historians argue there's no proof of its existence. There is agreement, however, that written history exists for sure from the
I wonder how that works. How can you just deny an entire dynasty existing?
Shang dynasty, which began around 1600 BCE.
Shang.
By the time we get to the Common Era, historical records become more detailed and reliable, giving us a clear picture of what ancient Chinese civilization was like. In its history as well, China was broken up and unified 6 times, and by the year 581 CE, it became one country under the Sui dynasty, which didn't last long. The subsequent decline of the dynasty ushered in the Tang dynasty, which is considered one of the country's many golden ages of cultural and artistic growth. In fact, it's still viewed as one of the periods that produced the country's greatest poetry. The Tang dynasty was also a time of great military progress, as an army of hundreds of thousands was amassed to defend the country against outside forces that sought to control much of the Silk Road.
People underestimate how powerful China was at the time. It's just there was so much fighting in between each other. Like, I've seen the Chinese history dramas, like little bits and pieces, but like, in the end, you should be glad they were fighting amongst themselves. Yeah.
If you're not familiar with it, the Silk Road was a network of trade routes that ran through China, across Asia, all the way to the tips of Africa and Europe. By the time the Tang dynasty was approaching 150 years of existence, though, China's greatest threat became itself. In the mid-700s, a long, slow decline of the dynasty began, and in the lead up to 755, this accelerated when a military general named Lushan gained more and more support in his formation of rebel forces. In December of that year, Lushan proclaimed himself the Emperor of Northern China, marking the beginning of the Yan dynasty. What followed is known as the Lushan Rebellion, which was a Yan dynasty military campaign with one goal, and that was to overthrow the imperial government. Now, years before the rebellion was even considered, there was a Tang dynasty soldier named Zhang Xun who was rapidly rising the military ranks, showing great promise as a potential military leader. In those days, China would assign soldiers with potential leadership capabilities to different regions, which offered them a chance to gain experience with governments at a much smaller level.
That's actually really smart. That's really smart because from what I understand from Chinese like culture and things I've read, every region is its like own little culture, even though they're all Chinese.
So when Xun was ready, he was sent to a nearby county where he did mostly administrative work while studying military history. And this is where he remained until the rise of Lushan and his rebellion. Once the rebellion began, the Yan army began its campaign by capturing cities integral to keeping China unified, working its way from north to south. As the rebels gained momentum in taking the first few cities, many generals and other military officers once loyal to the Tang dynasty saw it as a sinking ship and aligned themselves with Lushan instead. Among them was Xun's commanding officer, who expected his men to follow him in joining the rebel army. Xun, however, was fiercely loyal to the Tang dynasty emperor. So when his superior asked him to form a delegation to welcome a rebel general on his way to the county to recruit more soldiers, Xun made other plans. He did as he was told in terms of putting a delegation together, but instead of bringing them to meet the rebel general, he led them to a temple of the founder of Taoism, a man named Lao Tzu. Taoism is a philosophy and religion that centers around humans and animals living in harmony with the universe, and Tzu was a revered figure in Chinese history, so Xun saw an opportunity to inspire the delegation. It was said that all
using religion or beliefs to inspire men is very, very tactical. Very
Tang Dynasty emperors were direct descendants of Tzu, and in gathering all the men at the temple, Xun gave a speech that supposedly brought the delegation to tears. At its conclusion, Xun waited to see what the men would do and was almost moved to tears himself when each of them swore allegiance to the Tang Dynasty.
Damn.
With this new momentum on his side, Xun then gathered more loyalists and formed an army of 1,000 volunteers and marched them to the key city of Yangzhou, where he stationed them at a fortress. When the rebels arrived shortly after to take the fortress, incredibly, despite being hopelessly outnumbered and facing a force of more than 15,000 soldiers, Xun's unit somehow managed to push back the rebel advance and kill more than 2/3 of them and force retreat.
Damn!
When Lushan launched a second attempt the following month, he did so with 40,000 soldiers. By then, Xun's numbers had grown as well, but only to around 3,000 troops. However, incredibly, once again, it would be all they need to successfully defend the city. During the battle, using their numbers to overwhelm the Tang fighters, the rebels deployed the use of ladders to try and scale the fortress walls, but Xun's men were ready for them. As soon as the ladders hit the walls and the rebels began to scale them, Xun's soldiers lit the ladders on fire and in turn set many of the advancing rebels ablaze too. Most of them then either fell to their deaths or succumbed to the flames once they returned to the ground.
By the way, choking to death on smoke is one of the worst ways to die. Fun fact.
And these waves of attacks continued as the rebels desperately tried to take out Xun's men in fortress. Because of their great defensive position though, Xun and his men managed to defeat wave after wave of rebel forces. Eventually, rebel soldiers were even refusing orders to scale the fortress walls, so Yan army leadership had to use a different approach. Instead of facing Xun head-on, the rebels would surround the city and choke off the Tang army supply line. This is when Xun turned to his knowledge of military strategy. Even with the rebels on all sides, he wanted to mount an offensive, but because he was so greatly outnumbered, he'd have to find a way to weaken the rebels. So as darkness fell one evening, Xun had some of his soldiers start playing war drums, which continued throughout the night.
Psychological warfare!
Meant the Tang army was mounting a night attack. The rebel general, a man named Yin Tzu-chi, ordered his men to remain on guard all night. And night after night afterward, the drums of war were played by Xun's forces until the rebels grew so used to them that they either slept right through the noise or didn't even bother to suit up to defend against a potential attack. Then, finally, when he was satisfied that the rebels had sufficiently let their guard down, Xun organized an ambush. In the fight that followed, Xun wanted to deal a crushing blow to the rebel forces by killing the rebel general. There was a big problem with that idea though. He had no idea what Tzu-chi looked like. But in perhaps one of the more genius moves in military history, Xun ordered his archers to start shooting weeds at the rebels instead of arrows. As the weeds hit them, the rebels at first believed they were being shot by arrows, but as they watched the weeds bounce off their armor, they broke out in laughter. They believed that this meant that Xun's men were out of arrows, and his commander sent word to the rebel general. Simultaneously, this meant everything was going as Xun planned. As messengers—
It's a psyop, dude. That's smart, man. I'm not gonna lie, I always think like thousands and thousands of years ago, I feel like people were a lot more stupid than we are now. But really, I think that people stood out like as generals and like kings and queens. Well, most of them, not all of them, obviously. But I kind of just think that people back then were stupider, but really they're not. They had to just deal with what they had. Entire city Eden, what kind of big back energy is that? Big back! They didn't have general education? Well, they had generals. Well, for example, here they said that the general went back and studied. So you had the privilege of learning in some capacities. But the general peasant is stupider.
Up to the rebel general's position, Xun kept a sharp eye on them, and as soon as he determined which of them was the rebel general, Xun gave the signal to the archers to unleash a barrage of arrows in his direction. As these arrows flew through the air, the rebels were distracted by the belief that the Tang forces were out of ammunition.
This is what we want, chat. Not an iPhone in sight, only men killing each other.
One arrow then found its mark, embedding itself in one of the rebel general's eyes and causing the rebels to panic and retreat. The rebel general would survive this, but over the course of the 16-day siege, more than 20,000 rebels were killed, cutting Lushan's army by more than half. This should have been a pivotal victory for the Tang dynasty, but the army as a whole was losing ground in other areas of China. By the following year, the Yan army had grown in excess of 130,000 men, all of which were by then focused on taking the key city of Suiyang. Overtaking it would open up the entire south of China to the growing army and put Lushan on track to ruling the entire country.
Damn.
When the Suiyang governor learned of the success Xun had in defending the fortress, he requested that Xun bring his army to the city. As the rebel army advanced southward, the governor knew that it was only a matter of time before they'd reach Suiyang, so he had actually been stockpiling food and supplies for a year. Unfortunately, the district governor, who outranked the Suiyang governor, ordered him to share supplies with the other forts in the district as the siege
of
Suiyang got underway in January 757. This decision would have unthinkable consequences as the siege wore on. As the siege got underway, the combined forces of Xun and the governor numbered just 6,800 troops, putting the rebels at a 19-1 advantage. As the rebels had done previously, they surrounded the city and cut off the army's ability to receive supplies.
Here it comes.
Months would then pass, and thanks to that fateful order to share food with the other forts, as well as an inability to import anything, by the summer, the men were down to just a small ration of rice every day. To supplement this, Tang soldiers were allowed to eat whatever animals, insects, and vegetation that were available within army lines, but this wasn't nearly enough to sustain the army over any significant length of time. Soon enough,
this is why I hated sieging in Total War. When I was a little kid, I felt bad for all the starving civilians inside of the cities and castles that I had. I would rather just like invade them instantly rather than starving them. I don't know. I know it's fictional, obviously, because it's a game, but still.
Xun's men were visibly worn down, and the rebel general saw this and ordered even more troops to the city. So with far more troops, an advantageous position, and a weakened Tang army, the rebels continued their assault, expecting to easily take control of Suiyang. But incredibly, they were continually repelled by Tang volunteers. These same men were starving and beyond the point of exhaustion, but every time the rebels would lean a ladder against the fortress walls, Tang soldiers were there to knock them down. At one point, the rebel general even attempted to attach horse-drawn carts to the fortress walls and pull them down, and while they made some headway, it was ultimately another failure that led to a considerable loss of Yan forces. At the same time, even though they had fought off the rebels' every attack, Xun's army was also rapidly dwindling. By the end of July, the Tang army only had 1,600 men left alive, with little chance of sending word out that they needed help. Xun knew that it was only a matter of time before they were overrun, but his men knew their orders were to fight to the last man. There was no option to surrender. If allowed to advance south of the city, the rebels would meet very little resistance and the Tang dynasty would be replaced. July then turned to August, and the Tang army had eaten almost every animal, vegetable, and insect within the city, and once again they were going hungry. Xun obviously couldn't let his men just starve to death, so he had to try to break through the rebel enemy's reinforced lines. He then handpicked 30 of his very best soldiers and placed Captain Nan Qiyun in charge of the mission. Nan was the Tang army's best and most promising soldier, so if he couldn't make it past the rebels to get the help they needed, no one could. And incredibly, once again, with very little effort, Nan and his men successfully collapsed the rebel lines on one side of the city and escaped with only 3 casualties. Then, from town to town and city to city, the remaining 27 men traveled, only to be rejected at every turn when they asked local governors for troops and food. When they reached the city of Linhui, Nan met with the governor, who had developed an obsessive rivalry with Xun in his own mind. The governor was known to be extremely jealous of Xun, and that was reason enough for him to decline the call for help. He did, however, take the opportunity to try to convince Nan into joining his own forces so his city could be better prepared when the rebels inevitably came there too.
Yep.
Just like the men waiting on him in Suiyang, Nan was starving, and the governor, being an opportunist, had a feast prepared for him. However, when he was brought to the feast, Nan took great offense and refused to eat because it would be unfair to those waiting at the fortress who were also starving.
What an honorable guy, man. He didn't stuff his face, man. That's like willpower beyond belief. The guy's starving.
He then told the governor that although he didn't earn his support and had failed his mission to bring help, he'd leave his own finger behind to prove his commitment to his task and that he had at least been there to try. History offers different versions of what happens next, but Nan supposedly actually did this by either cutting or biting before turning and leaving the city with nothing. As horrifying as that was, the mission wasn't a total loss for Nan, though.
Why don't they make an Assassin's Creed about this? This is sick, man. Maybe not directly about this, but like maybe like a fictional story like this. Based on this?
Their local governor did send 3,000 troops back with him, but to even get back, Nan would have to lead all of them through rebel lines to re-enter Suiyang. And just as they did on the way out, they'd have to battle their way back in. This time though, the outcome was much, much worse. Of the 3,000 troops, only 1,000 made it back through the army lines. It was better than nothing, and the slight boost in numbers would help in the defense of the city, but it also added another 1,000 mouths to an already dire situation. And this inability to get food into the city caused spirits among the Tang army to plummet. There was quite literally next to nothing to eat in the entire city, and what little food remained was so coveted that the citizens were trading their own children just for a few morsels of anything edible. After long enough, there wasn't a single thing left to eat, so desperate for any kind of sustenance, the Tang army—
What do you mean trade your kids for what? Oh my god!
had only one option left. The army first started by collecting the recently passed soldiers and civilians in the city before cooking and consuming those they amassed.
Oh my god.
Then, when all of those had been eaten and the men began to go hungry again, Xun stood in front of them one night and gave a short speech. In it, he gave them high praise for their loyalty to the Tang Emperor, especially in the face of their difficult predicament, but he wished there was a way he could repay the debt he felt he owed to them. Then, he grabbed the hand of his mistress, who was standing by, and brought her up in front of the men.
No!
Then he told them that they had sacrificed for him, so now it was his turn to sacrifice for them. With that, Xun killed his mistress right there in front of them.
Now, is this a myth or is this like actually what happened? Like, is this mythology or is this real? That's terrifying. It's legit, it's real. That's
After this was finished, he ordered the cooks to come and prepare a meal for them. Understandably, many of the soldiers refused and were openly crying about what they witnessed, but Xun ordered them to eat, so the hungry soldiers relented. This first incident was a door that never should have been opened and sparked chaos in the city of Suiyang. Afterward, the soldiers walked the city streets and rounded up all the women before marching them back to the fortress. There, the same thing happened to them that happened to Xun's mistress. When all of the women of the city were gone, the soldiers turned to the old men, and then when they were gone, they turned to the young. The governor also let all of his servants be used for the same purpose to prolong the army's defense of the city. Horrifyingly though, the soldiers' full bellies only delayed the inevitable. With every attempt by the rebels to take the city, the Tang army was losing more and more men.
Well, they didn't know about how eating... Like, if you eat parts of a human, you start going crazy. I'm not sure what it's called. I remember, yeah, kuru, whatever it's called, when it starts fucking with your brain. Yeah, that shit, like, oh my god, man. They're just slowly going crazy in that fortress or that town.
Through the early part of October, Xun's soldiers continued to fight valiantly, but when the number of Tang soldiers dwindled, the Yan army finally succeeded in gaining control of the city. The rebels then captured Xun, Nan, and the governor, who were brought in front of the rebel general. In these three men, and particularly Xun, the rebel general saw bravery and how much of an asset they would be to the Yan offensive. A conversation then took place between Xun and the general that was documented, and during it, he asked Xun why he fought with so much determination that his eyelids ripped and his teeth cracked. And as he did, the rebel general stuck the blade of his dagger between Xun's lips to force him to open his mouth. When he finally did, he could see that all but 3 of Xun's teeth were broken. After he pulled the dagger out of Xun's mouth, Xun told him that he wanted to use those cracked teeth to eat all the traitors that were now occupying the city. It was apparent in that moment that there was nothing the general could say or do to get these men to join the rebels. So along with 33 other soldiers
he turned into Asmongold. Only 3 real teeth left.
Loyal to the Tang dynasty, Xun, Nan, and the governor were put to death by the rebels. For the better part of 10 months, Xun held off 130,000 Yan rebels and didn't give up Suiyang until there were only 400 total Tang soldiers remaining. And at no point during the siege did Xun have more than 10,000 men with which to defend the city. This is a feat that belongs with some of human military history's greatest stands, and what Xun and his soldiers accomplished during the siege of Suiyang is just as impressive as some of the more well-known moments of human resilience in world military history. But obviously, was it
worth it though?
Worth the cost? Ultimately, the long defense of the city prevented the Yan army from advancing further south and ultimately winning the war. Although they took the city after a long and costly campaign, rebel control of the city wouldn't last. 3 days after Suiyang fell, Tang army reinforcements finally arrived, and after 4 days of intense fighting, the city was reclaimed. The Lushan rebellion would then continue until 763, but the Tang dynasty ultimately came out victorious. At the same time, across the board, this rebellion was incredibly costly for China. It's believed that as many as 36 million people were lost during the campaign, which amounted to 2/3 of the country's population.
Bro, 2/3 of the population over infighting. Guys, I'm telling you, man, there's something very telling when an entire empire constantly fights with each other. If they just united and blasted the entire world, it would be possible. That would... like, ow, man. Oh my god. Yeah,
But
China
even despite eventually
terrified.
defeating the rebels, the Tang dynasty was weakened past the point of recovery, and it collapsed in 907, resulting in China being divided into multiple independent kingdoms. During the period of time when Xun and his soldiers were maintaining their strength, it's thought they managed to reduce the city's population by between 20 and 30,000 people. So in the end, were they really successful?
Not really.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Wow. Nah, it wasn't worth the chat. Getting bored is never worth it. Clappies, chat! That was really enlightening. Chat, don't eat people, it's bad. Makes you lose all your teeth and turn into asthma bald.